You believe, you comprehend time, you glance at clocks, you witness your own aging, you recall what happened last week and make plans for next month. Time appears self-evident, natural, simple, but that comfortable certainty, that's not time itself, that's merely sensation, an elaborate neurological illusion your consciousness constructs. Most of us carry around this romantic notion that time resembles a flowing stream. We imagine ourselves as passengers drifting along currents from what already happened toward what hasn't occurred yet. We think time moves, advances, progresses, but here's where that appealing metaphor collapses completely. If time flows like a river, at what velocity does this river flow? 1 second per second? That's circular nonsense. That's equivalent to declaring a chair is 1 chair tall. It reveals precisely nothing about how reality actually operates. The reality is considerably stranger, far more mechanical, and frankly much less poetic than flowing water. Time doesn't flow anywhere. Time doesn't propel you forward. And if you believe you've mastered how time operates simply because you can mentally count seconds, prepare yourself for a serious conceptual shock. Let's begin with what actually occurs inside your skull, because that's where the fundamental confusion originates. You assume your internal timekeeping mechanism functions like a precision instrument. It absolutely doesn't. It's actually a chaotic collection of approximation strategies your brain cobbles together. Consider this straightforward experiment. Attempt to count 60 seconds purely mentally. Just sit completely still and count 1, 2, 3 in your head. You think you're measuring time accurately, but what you're actually doing is executing a highly specific, deeply personal cognitive program that varies dramatically between individuals. Some people, when counting, literally hear an auditory voice inside their consciousness. They're essentially talking to themselves internally, subvocalizing each number. 1, 2, 3. If someone suddenly interrupts and asks them to speak aloud, they immediately lose their count. The cognitive machinery jams completely. But others, and this is where it becomes fascinating, don't experience any auditory voice whatsoever. Instead, they visualize images. They might see something resembling a measuring tape with sequential numbers advancing past like a stock ticker. Click, 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 each number appearing visually. If you employ that visual measurement system, you can actually read text or review a shopping list while simultaneously counting time accurately. You can organize objects, examine visual patterns, and still maintain that mental ticker advancing perfectly. But the person counting with auditory vocalization, they can't read a single word without completely losing their time count. This reveals something profound about consciousness and perception. What you subjectively experience as time passing is purely a mental construction, a pattern recognition game your neural architecture plays with itself. It varies wildly from one person to another. It is not a universal constant experienced identically by all conscious beings. It's a biological hallucination, a useful fiction. So when we discuss physics, when we examine the universe itself, we must completely discard your subjective brain experience. We must stop discussing how time feels and start examining what time actually is, operationally. In physics, we must adopt what's called an operational approach. That means we don't ask philosophical questions like, what is time's essential nature? Because that's a question for academics who enjoy endless debates over beverages. Instead, we ask the practical question, how precisely do we measure it? And the answer is almost disappointingly straightforward. Time is fundamentally just a method for ordering events sequentially. That's the entire story. It's a labeling system, nothing more mystical than that. Imagine you possess a standard deck of playing cards. You arrange them in a linear sequence. You can state the jack comes before the queen and the king follows the queen. The cards themselves aren't moving anywhere. The table's surface isn't flowing beneath them. The sequential order is simply a structural property of how the cards happen to be arranged spatially. Time functions as the table. Individual events function as the cards. When we say time passes, we're simply reading the card sequence from left to right. This brings us to the most significant conceptual error nearly everyone makes. You think time is a container, a receptacle. You imagine the universe as an enormous empty box, and time is a clock mounted on that box's wall, steadily ticking away. Even if we removed everything, if we eliminated all stars, all planets, all atoms, all electromagnetic radiation, you think that clock would continue ticking. Tick, 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 forever. Absolutely wrong. This is the Newtonian perspective, and it's been dead for over a century. Time is not a background stage upon which events unfold. Time is fundamentally a measure of change itself. If absolutely nothing in the universe changes, no atoms vibrate, no light propagates, no energy shifts position, then time stops having any meaning whatsoever. It ceases to exist as a meaningful concept. You cannot define a second without some physical process to mark it. A pendulum swinging, a quartz crystal vibrating, a cesium atom oscillating at a specific frequency. Time is not separate from the physical contents of the universe. Time is a property emerging from that physical content. This is where your intuition violently resists. You protest, but surely time acts upon things. Time causes aging. Time makes food decay. No, it absolutely doesn't. This is a linguistic trap, a grammatical confusion masquerading as physics. Time is not an agent with causal power. Time doesn't possess hands that reach into your refrigerator and spoil your milk. Bacteria accomplish that. Chemical reactions accomplish that. Entropy accomplishes that. Time is merely the bookkeeping system we employ to track the rate at which those physical reactions occur. Saying time did it is logically equivalent to saying inches constructed the building. Inches didn't construct anything. Carpenters constructed it. Inches simply tell you where walls are positioned. Time is the measuring ruler, not the construction worker. Let's extend this ruler analogy further, because this is where concepts become genuinely strange. If time is simply a ruler we use for measuring distances between events, what happens if that ruler itself is flexible, stretchable, compressible? This isn't science fiction or wild speculation. This is directly measurable empirical fact. We used to assume that 1 second was 1 second anywhere throughout the universe. If you positioned a clock on Earth and an identical clock on Mars, they would tick in perfect synchronization. It feels intuitively obvious. It feels correct, and it's completely, utterly false. The rate at which clocks tick depends fundamentally on where they're located and how rapidly they're moving through space. This is not a mechanical defect of the clock. It is a fundamental feature of reality itself. Imagine you're driving a vehicle across an enormous flat sheet of paper. You can drive northward or you can drive eastward. If you drive purely north, you're making maximum progress in the northward direction. But if you turn the steering wheel and begin driving northeast, you're dividing your speed. You're moving somewhat north and somewhat east simultaneously. You aren't progressing north as rapidly as before, because you diverted some of that motion eastward. Now replace north with time and east with space. This is the fundamental essence of relativity. You are always moving through the universe at a constant speed. But that motion is divided between movement through space and movement through time. If you sit perfectly motionless in your chair, you're dedicating all your motion to traveling through time. You're traveling into the future at maximum velocity, 1 second per second from your perspective. But the instant you stand up and walk, or board a rocket and fly, you're diverting some of that motion into spatial movement. You're moving through space, which means you mathematically must move slower through time. Your clock slows down, your biological aging slows down. You aren't breaking physics. You're simply changing direction on the cosmic map. If you could move at light speed, the absolute maximum speed limit of the universe, you would be using 100% of your motion for space. You would have zero motion remaining for time. For a photon of light, Time does not pass whatsoever. It is created and destroyed in the identical instant from its own reference frame. The universe is frozen solid. Now you might be thinking, I don't feel my wristwatch slowing when I run to catch the bus. Of course you don't. You're far too slow. You're a biological tortoise. The effects are minuscule at human speeds, but they're absolutely real and measurable. We must program satellites with this mathematics. GPS satellites orbit rapidly, so their time differs from your time on the surface. We literally must adjust their internal clocks constantly. If we didn't perform these adjustments, your GPS would be inaccurate by miles within a single day. There's another aspect of time that deceives us, and it connects back to that counting problem, the idea of pattern recognition and memory. We perceive time as possessing a direction, an arrow pointing one way. The past is fixed and immutable. The future is open and undetermined. You can remember eating breakfast, but you cannot remember eating dinner tomorrow. Why this asymmetry? If physics equations generally work identically forwards and backwards, and most fundamental equations do, why can't we remember the future? If you film a planet orbiting a star and play the footage backward, it appears perfectly fine. It obeys all gravitational laws. But if you film an egg falling onto a floor and shattering, then play it backward, everyone immediately knows it's reversed. The yellow yolk doesn't leap off the floor, spontaneously assemble itself into a sphere, and seal itself inside a reconstructed shell. Here's the secret. This asymmetry isn't about time itself at all. It's about probability. It's about disorder and organization. It is vastly, enormously easier to break an egg than to construct one from scratch. There are billions of possible configurations for a broken egg yolk, scattered here, shell fragments there, membrane torn in countless ways. But there exists only one highly specific arrangement where the egg is whole and intact. So, as physical objects move and interact randomly, they naturally transition from organized states with few configurations toward disorganized states with many possible configurations. We call this entropy, the measure of disorder. And this is the only reason you subjectively feel an arrow of time. You're watching the universe shuffle its deck of cards. You started with a perfectly ordered deck, and every second that passes is simply the universe shuffling it progressively more. You can't unshuffle the deck simply by wishing. This means your sensation of time flowing is actually just your brain registering the increase of disorder in the universe. You're fundamentally a disorder detector. When you distinguish past from future, you're really just distinguishing less messy from more messy. If the universe existed in a state of maximum disorder, maximum entropy, where everything was evenly distributed and nothing interesting was happening anywhere, your brain wouldn't be able to distinguish past from future at all. There would be no egg to break. There would be no memory to form. In a thermal equilibrium universe, the arrow of time vanishes completely. So let's return to those individuals counting mentally. The ones seeing the visual tape measure versus the ones hearing the auditory voice. They're both struggling to impose a rigid linear structure onto a universe that is actually far more flexible and strange than linear. We construct these mental models, these counting machines, because we need them for survival. We need to predict when danger is approaching or when resources will be available. We evolved to track duration accurately enough to survive, but we absolutely did not evolve to understand the dimension of time itself. Our brains are optimized for efficiency, not accuracy. We focus intensely on the present moment because that's where we must act to survive. But in physics, now is an extraordinarily slippery, problematic concept. If you and I stand next to each other, our now is effectively identical. But if you're on a planet a million light years distant and you begin walking away from me, your definition of now slices through the universe at a different angle than mine does. What you consider to be happening right now might exist in my future. What I consider to be happening now might exist in your past. There is no universal now that blankets the entire universe like a sheet. The universe is a block of events, a four-dimensional loaf of bread, and how you slice that loaf depends entirely on how fast you're moving relative to other observers. This is profoundly difficult to grasp. It feels incorrect. It feels like I'm telling you that up is down and left is right. But that's because you're attempting to translate the high-level language of the universe into the low-level language of your evolved biology. You're trying to count socks when you should be measuring light beams. When you attempt to force the universe to conform to your intuition, you generate confusion. You generate paradoxes. But when you release what you think time is, when you stop trying to count it like a pile of laundry and start measuring it like a dimension of space, suddenly the mathematical equations work. Suddenly the universe makes coherent sense. We're not finished because even if we accept that time is a dimension and that it stretches and compresses with velocity, there's a much deeper question lurking at the foundation. We've discussed measuring time and we've discussed the arrow of disorder, but we haven't addressed the beginning. If time is fundamentally a measure of change, what happens when you run the cosmic movie backward all the way to the first frame? If the universe is expanding and we reverse it, it contracts smaller and smaller, hotter and hotter. Eventually you reach a point where the laws of physics themselves begin to melt and lose meaning. You see, all our clocks, our atoms, our planets, our light beams, they exist inside the universe. But if the universe itself originated in an event we label the Big Bang, does it make logical sense to ask what happened before that event? This is the ultimate test of your new definition of time. If time is simply a method for ordering events inside the universe, then asking what happened before the universe might be as nonsensical as asking what exists north of the North Pole. It sounds like a grammatically valid question, but geometrically it's complete gibberish. There is no north of the North Pole. There may be no time before time began. And yet we still experience that nagging feeling, that internal counter, that voice counting 1, 2, 3. We desperately want the universe to possess a backstory. We crave a timeline that extends backward forever. It's psychologically difficult to accept that the measuring tape might simply start, that the counting machine had an on switch. This creates fundamental friction between our psychology and our cosmology. We are finite beings, attempting to comprehend the infinite using tools constructed from meat and electrical impulses. It's remarkable we understand anything whatsoever. Consider the patterns again. The person who sees the tape measure mentally can count while reading because they're employing different neural circuits. Visual versus verbal processing. Physics operates similarly. Classical mechanics was the verbal counting approach. It functioned adequately for everyday situations. Relativity is the visual tape measure approach. It allows us to process complex patterns that the old framework couldn't handle at all. We're constantly upgrading our mental software to match the hardware of reality, and the upgrade process is painful. It requires discarding ideas we cherish, like the flowing river of time. But here's the beautiful part. Even though your intuition is fundamentally wrong, even though your internal clock is a biological hack, and even though time is a flexible, relative, bendable dimension rather than a strict metronome, it still functions perfectly well for you. You can still cook an egg. You can still meet someone for coffee at 2 p.m. The bizarre weirdness of relativity is hidden beneath the surface. You don't need to understand the combustion engine to drive the vehicle, and you don't need to understand space-time metrics to live your daily life. But isn't it better to know? Isn't it better to understand that the engine exists? This brings us back to that strange experiment with counting. Remember the difference between the person who hears numbers and the person who visualizes them. This isn't just a parlor trick or curiosity. It reveals a terrifying gap in how we communicate about the universe. When two people discuss something complex like time or relativity or consciousness, they think they're speaking the same language. They nod in agreement. They say, "I understand completely." But what's really happening? You're running a massive invisible translation scheme beneath conscious awareness. You take the words I speak and convert them into your private internal imagery, which might be completely alien from mine. I say 1 minute, and I visualize a clock face. You hear a voice saying 60 seconds. We arrive at the same numerical answer, so we think we agree, but the cognitive machinery inside is totally different. This matters for physics because it exposes the fragility of common sense. Common sense is simply the collection of prejudices and assumptions you acquired by age 18. It's built on your specific internal imagery and lived experience. If your mental image of time is a tape with numbers advancing, you'll struggle to understand how time can bend. If your mental image is a voice counting, you'll struggle to understand how time can be spatial. When we attempt to teach you about quantum vacuum or the curvature of space-time, we aren't simply giving you new facts to memorize. We're asking you to delete your operating system. We're asking you to throw away the tape measure and silence the voice completely. And that's why it feels so difficult. That's why your brain actively rejects it. You aren't just learning new information. You're translating against the grain of your own biology, fighting your own survival-optimized neural architecture.